Recording. Okay. Do you see anything?
I see you, and I see Youri is recording the call.
All right. Perfect. Okay. Well, everyone, welcome to another episode of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are joined by a very special guest. He was one of my first interview subjects when I was briefly trying to start out in journalism. Rick Sterling, who is an independent journalist, media critic, NGO critic, as well as a member of the Syria Solidarity campaign. And we're once again we're going to return to the subject of Syria, which I think is the forgotten war, which I think is an ongoing tragedy, and which I think is a scandal in the anti-war left and the broad anti-war movement's failure in pushing back against the propaganda in Syria and trying to stop this atrocious thing that's happening between the West and the Gulf and trying to destroy Syria. So, Rick, thank you for joining us on 1+1.
Nice to be here, Youri. Good to be with you again.
Perfect. And apologies to the followers of 1+1. This episode was originally supposed to be posted the week before last week, but there were some problems. Hopefully that doesn't happen this time around. So, okay. So, Rick, let's get right into it. So, Rick, I wanted to ask you, and sorry to have to ask you all these questions again, but last time, the first time I interviewed you, we talked about the Syria war as a Western Gulf war on a sovereign nation. And we talked about Saudi Arabia's role in Syria, Qatar's role in Syria, and of course we talked about the United States and its close allies, Britain, Canada, France, and so forth. But we didn't talk about one country which made a lot of news last year, and there was so much division on the left as to what to do about it, and that's Turkey's role in Syria. So could you explain Turkey's role in the Syria tragedy and its sort of multiple personality disorder explain Turkey's role in the Western Gulf-backed war explain Turkey's role in the Western Gulf-backed war in Syria.
Well, Turkey has been heavily involved from the beginning. Of course, several million refugees have left Syria and gone into Turkey. In fact, there were even reports that Turkey was setting up refugee camps before the conflict broke out in March of 2011. They were building refugee centers, and they welcomed families from northern Syria. And basically, the story is that some of the jihadists took their families into Turkey and went back into Syria to launch the assault on the government, and thought it would be a short war. In fact, they thought that they were leaving their families for months or perhaps a half a year, but not longer. As we know, the war is now, it's 2020, 9 years later, and it's still going on. After that, so Turkey has been a center. Now, there was a woman named, a Lebanese American reporter named Serena Shim, and she did some amazing reporting in the early years of the war, which proved conclusively that Turkey was supporting the armed groups. She had videos of military training in so-called refugee camps. She interviewed various Turkish people that had insights on this, and she filmed a World Food Program truck that was going into Syria across the border that had jihadists and weapons in it. She died very suspiciously of of a car accident. Supposedly a cement truck ran into her, and she died. That in itself is an amazing story, because I've talked with the mother of Serena Shim, who's an American. She's got a Lebanese father, and so she's binational. She's Lebanese and American, but she grew up in the Midwest USA. I spoke with the mother, and it turned out that Serena Shim was not killed in the car crash. She was transported to a hospital in Turkey, a different hospital from her cousin, who was also in the car and was injured. And mysteriously, Serena Shim, she aged about 24 or 25, died of a heart attack in the hospital. The whole thing is extremely suspicious.
Wow.
She had earlier had a confrontation with Prime Minister and now President Erdogan, and basically she had been, the day before she died, she had gone on air. She was a reporter for Press TV.
Yeah.
She had gone on air saying she was somewhat nervous because she had reports that Turkish intelligence was looking for her. And she said on air, and she was a very experienced journalist. She had been doing this work for several years. She said, I have nothing to hide. I welcome an interview with the Turkish intelligence if they want. And I'm here doing my job. But in any case, she died the next day. So the significance of this is that from early on, we had conclusive reports. We had very solid evidence of Turkey arming the insurgents, of being a base for the insurgents and supporting it in various ways. And that only escalated until in 2014, 15, 16, when ISIS was emerging as a major force. The ISIS forces were all being transported, and even you had Chinese Uyghurs who were going into Syria via Turkey and being temporarily given Turkish passports to arrive in Turkey and to settle there with the families. Some of the families staying in Turkey, other families going into northern Syria. In fact, part of Idlib, you've got Chinese Uyghurs who are there by the thousands. In any case, Turkey has been heavily involved from the start and continues to be heavily involved.
And so now we know from WikiLeaks, from WikiLeaks email leaks and document leaks, Hillary Clinton said herself that Saudi Arabia and Qatar was exporting ISIS into Syria. Joe Biden himself let slip that the Turks, our allies, the Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, exported Islamic extremists into Syria. I don't know if he explicitly said ISIS, but yeah, we know who they are. But if memory corrects me, Turkey. So was Turkey exporting ISIS per se, or were they exporting a rival Sunni Wahhabi Salafist group?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Turkish government, the AKP, is closely allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an international organization, and there are various flavors of it depending what country you're talking about, whether it's Qatar or Egypt or Turkey or whatever. But they are of a similar mindset, and they work together internationally quite closely. And for example, Qatar was heavily involved. And now Qatar is kind of at odds with, well, it is at odds with Saudi Arabia. And they are both extremist Muslim variations. But there are, as much as there are similarities, there are also some differences. In any case, Qatar and Turkey have been allied in supporting some elements of ISIS, of the armed opposition, and including looking the other way, if not actively colluding with ISIS, which was, of course, recruiting people from all over the world. You live in Belgium. There were thousands of Belgian citizens went into Syria via Turkey. I grew up in Canada. There were hundreds of Canadians, some of them blue-eyed, blonde-haired Canadians, who were recruited and ended up mostly dying in Syria, being recruited, and maybe they would initially go with the Al Qaeda, the main Al Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, but then some of them went over to ISIS. ISIS was paying more at a certain point at their peak. So, there's been as much as there were differences between Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, and they would acknowledge the reality, they didn't do anything to stop it. And it's clear that as much as they sometimes express some criticisms, they were actually in collaboration. In fact, they were all part of this big coalition of criminal coalition called the Friends of Syria, cynically. And it wasn't until Russia intervened in late September of 2015 that they put a stop to the mass shipment of the mass transportation of oil from eastern Syria. They just bombed the whole caravan of the oil truck convoy that was taking place under the eyes of the U.S., which failed to do anything. And the oil, of course, was going into Turkey, and it was being shipped abroad from the Turkish ports, with one of the major shipping lines being owned by Prime Minister Erdogan's son. So that's how close the connection is.
And I think I joked with you last time, and I'll redo the joke again. So basically, little Bana Abded and all of those people who want to name their all those Syrian refugees, I want to name their kids after Erdogan, the country of Turkey. Shouldn't they actually be pissed off at Erdogan, since he basically exported the ISISes of the world and the other rival Islamic jihads, which is destroying their country, even if they hate Assad and have legitimate grievances against him?
Well, Turkey's been playing a very negative, destructive role in the conflict right from the get-go. They fueled the controversy. I think some of the leaders of the militant groups lived in southern Turkey and commuted. These are their words: commuted to the front lines and to the battlefield. So that's how close the relation has been. Of course, this all is in clear violation of international law and the UN Charter, which says that there should be no intervention in the internal affairs of sovereign countries. And what the U.S., what Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Israel, what the whole gang have been doing is in blatant violation of that important tenet of international law.
Before we talk about the Kurdish rebels in Syria and how Turkey is involved with that, didn't the first alleged chemical weapons attack? Now, if there was a chemical weapons attack, it was not the Syrian government did it. I think Seymour Hersh, didn't he say that that an actual red sarin, which the Western media, Qatari funded media, blamed on Assad, wasn't that actually Turkish-backed rebels that that used it? When Obama did the I'm not my red lines for intervening in Syria is if the Assad government uses chemical weapons, right?
Right. Well, Obama made the statement about the red line. If he said something like, if any chemical weapons were used, that would be a red line, that would cross my red line, implying that the U.S. would have to get involved. Well, of course, that statement, which was made in either in the fall of 2012 or the spring of 2013. I don't recall at the moment, but that statement was an open invitation to staging a chemical weapons event. Nothing could be more clear. And in fact, in the spring of 2013, there were exactly that. And the UN started investigating it, and there were some. Carla Del Ponte, one of the investigators from Italy, said the evidence points to the rebels being responsible. And the big event that we're referring to, and the big event that internationally, was August 21 of 2013. And the reporting that came out afterward, whether it was from Seymour Hersh or Robert Perry, who are, after all, are American investigative journalists. The evidence that uncovered by Erdogan was that Turkey was involved, that it was radical, that it was part of the armed opposition, the fanatical opposition, supported actively by Turkey. And to support that, two people had been captured in Turkey earlier with sarin. They had actually been, and then they mysteriously were released from prison. And then to further provide evidence, two members of the Turkish parliament had documents which they said proved the connection between Turkey and the armed opposition which staged the event on August 21 of 2013. Certainly the media around the world was prepared. They were fully prepared for this. They had their the cameras ready, and the means of conveying this around the world. It was quite astounding. And you're a journalist. I'm a journalist. It takes some preparation. This doesn't happen automatically. Being able to send your message around the world and capture major media within 12 hours, the way that event happened. So they were prepared. There were big forces that jumped on the bandwagon, and with the obvious goal of promoting a U.S. NATO intervention in the conflict. So that was and yet to this day, people still talk about that as a failing of Obama for not quote unquote enforcing the red line. Obama himself, I am very critical, because he could put a stop by this by exposing all of the evidence which pointed to it not being the Syrian government. Now, this is important because this still goes on today. Here we are 7 years later, and people are still talking about Syria and the chemical weapons and the sarin gas attack that they weren't sufficiently punished for. So
and also while they're blaming the Assad government for using chemical weapons, the Assad, I hate to say this, and it is going to piss people off, but the Assad government did not use chemical weapons on their people.
That's correct. Yeah.
The person that did use chemical weapons was the Western Turkish Gulf-backed thugs and and reactionary Islamists, these Wahhabi Salafist thugs who want to make Syria into another Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya.
Right. Yeah. And it's sad in a way that here we have another day. It's not that long ago that they were talking about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was the so-called basis for the invasion in 2003, and that's been conclusively proven to be not true, not correct. It was a false belief. And yet here we are in the next decade, and the same thing continues. When are we going to learn?
You wonder, and that's why it stuns me that so many left-leaning outlets, call it independent media, call it non-profit media, or just left-leaning media in general, have completely jumped the shark on Syria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Which
it's true. Yeah.
which leads to this question, which are, who are the Kurdish rebels in Syria? Why do so many leftists support the which is essentially a secessionist movement there? And what should have been the response to the Turkish assault on the Kurdish rebels in Syria?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we need to look at the big picture to begin with. The largest percent of Kurds is in Turkey. Some 14 million are in Turkey. Nowhere near that many, 1 or 2 million in Syria. So in Turkey, the Kurdish population is a largely progressive force. They formed their own political party, and actually, I shouldn't say their own party. They formed a political party which unites across ethnic and religious differences. In other words, it's not a sectarian party, either ethnically or religiously, and it unites all progressives. It's called the HDP, the People's Progressive Party, and they are specifically organizing within Turkey to challenge the two other parties and the dominant AKP. So and they are not seeking secession. And they are seeking to unite.
This new Kurdish party that you were just describing, but this is one in Turkey, right?
Correct. Now that's in Turkey. There is also the militant support, the PKK, which is a militant group which traditionally was fighting for Turkish secession. But the majority of Kurds within Turkey are not seeking secession. They're seeking to, within the country that they're living, they're seeking to gain Turkish, rights for language rights and cultural rights, but they're not seeking independence. The U.S. in Syria, on the other hand, the United States has manipulated a faction of Syrian Kurds to work with it. They've provided a lot of money. They've given military training. They've given uniforms, and they are trying to use that as a tool, and they are using those forces as a tool to divide Syria, to try to break up Syria, to prevent the Syrian government from regaining control over its entire land. Now, the Kurds are primarily in the north and the east, primarily just the northeast, but they have expanded their sphere of influence with the United States throughout eastern Syria, which is the oil-producing area of Syria. And they are basically stealing the oil resources of the Syrian government, and the U.S. is using that to fund their operations with the Kurds who participate, so the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. In parallel, you have this phenomenon of Rojava, which simply means the West in the Kurdish language. This mythical area that is supposedly a distinct political entity, which is it's part real and it's part myth. The mythology has certainly been built up and promoted by the U.S. The goal is very negative, and it will prove to be, in the long run, very much against the interests of the Kurdish people, I believe. And it's similar. We can look back to in Nicaragua in the 1980s and how the U.S. promoted an armed insurrection group to break away the new Sandinista government with the Contras, and the U.S. poured money in. They did some interesting tactics at that time. They promoted women, Nicaraguan women. In fact, there's a great photo of a women Contra battalion, and the goal very specifically, this was marketing. This was marketing to a Western audience, which is more sympathetic to to a feminist perspective, and it does look good, but it's mostly marketing and promotion, and the long range goal of not caring about the Syrian Kurdish people, just caring about what the U.S.'s goals are, their long-term goals, which are to divide and weaken Syria and prevent Syria from being able to recover.
Are the Kurdish rebels, and it's basically a Kurdish secession movement in Syria. So are the Kurdish rebels? Is it true that they are this anarcho-syndicalist, pro-feminist, non-sectarian force in Syria? Because many Trotskyist websites, many far-left websites, and even many people who watch the Democracy Nows of the world, or watch corporate liberal left-leaning media like Vice, always depicts the Kurdish secession movement in Syria as this wonderful non-sectarian, anarcho, far-left, wonderful force, that these are the moderate rebels that we should be supporting in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I've wanted to do an article on that with giving a lot more evidence and investigating the facts of the situation. And I hope I can do that sometime in the future. Just very briefly, right now, I can say that it's more promotion than reality.
Okay. Then okay. So now, so then why is Turkey attacking these? So why is Turkey attacking these Kurds, and what should be the anti-imperialist response, regardless of what spectrum you fall in that?
Well, I think Turkey is attacking the Kurds for a couple of reasons. Number one is because Turkey, there was a reconciliation agreement, there was a ceasefire agreement between the PKK and the Turkish armed forces. And in Turkey there was but the PKK has had a base in Syria for a long time, and so if you listen to the Turks, they'll say we're going into there because we're chasing the terrorists who are based in Syria. Which ironically, that's the same thing times 100, with Turkey being a base of support for jihadists going into Syria. But there is some truth to the PKK, the armed insurgents from Turkey, having a base in Syria, northern Syria, near the border with Turkey. But at the same time, they have the problem is that there was a ceasefire that was very effective, that was going on between the PKK and the Turkish armed forces, that the Turkish undermined, and they did that intentionally because of the success of the political party that I was referring to earlier, the HDP, the People's Progressive Party, or the People's Democratic Party. The success of there prevented Erdogan from winning the election in early 2015, because the PKK crossed the 10% threshold, and they gained enough seats to prevent Erdogan from winning. I believe that Erdogan saw it as very much in his interest to promote conflict with the Kurds, there was a break. There were some bombings that took place. The victims were always Kurds, and the PKK retaliated, and it unfolded from there. But the impetus driving it was Erdogan's desire to end the ceasefire, which was turning out to be very good for the people of Turkey, but bad for him personally. So what happened then?
Because it's safe to say that Erdogan is an ultra Turkish Islamic nationalist of a certain kind.
Yeah, that is correct. So now, so what happened after that with the breakdown? That Turkey invaded parts of southern. The Turkish armed forces attacked parts of southern Turkey, which are majority Kurdish population, and drove some people across the border into Syria, and attacked people in southern Turkey generally. And stirred up the conflict. And now what they're doing, so that what the Turks have done since then is they invaded northern parts of northern Turkey to confront PKK and also to just grab land. It's a land grab operation. And so if you listen to what Erdogan says, he will talk about relocating Syrian refugees in that no man's land. Well, or not a no man's land, but that Turkish-controlled region of northern Syria. Well, if he wants to relocate Syrian refugees, why doesn't he locate them in Turkey, on the Turkish side of the border? Why does he have to invade and take away land? It's because it's partly a land grab operation, and it's partly an attack on the Kurdish community with the goal of isolating it and preventing the kind of progressive solidarity which the HDP, the People's Democratic Party, was building.
So Erdogan was, for his own narrow imperialism and a way to whip up support, was basically using the Syrian Kurds and the Kurds that he betrayed in this peace movement, for his own narrow, selfish reasons, and also for imperial reasons.
Well, and primarily Turkish Kurds, Turks with Kurdish ethnicity. It was to fire up that kind of tension as well.
What should be international? What should be the anti-imperialist response to Turkey's assault on the well, not just on the Syrian Kurds, but Syria in general?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the UN Charter is stands the test of time. We need international law. If progressive people, anti-imperialist people can rely on the UN Charter, the Geneva agreement on international law, because that is a solid foundation, which is non-intervention in the foreign affairs of a different country. What the U.S. and Israel and Turkey are doing in Syria is a clear violation. Going back to referring again to the Nicaraguan case, Nicaragua took that case to the International Court at The Hague, which is distinct from the International Criminal Court, which was created much later with a different goal. But the International Court of Justice made a ruling that the U.S. violated international law with their support of insurgents in Contra, supplying training and weaponizing the Contras, and that they owed reparations to Nicaragua. Now, of course, they did not do that, but that ruling stands nonetheless, and it's a good example. And that is a similar case with Syria, except Syria is vastly more people, more countries have ganged up on Syria, and it's been, as destructive as it was in Nicaragua, it's vastly more destructive with Syria.
Yeah, definitely much more volatile because it's in a volatile region, and Assad, whatever one may think of him, but he is the sovereign leader of that country. And as you've mentioned to me, and other people have mentioned to me, he does run a very very much a secular, non-sectarian government. Well,
Yes.
not just that, not secular, non-sectarian society, right?
That's right. I mean, it's very, very clear the distinction between the insurgents, their sectarianism, and their reliance on foreign powers versus the Syrian government, which is genuinely secular, genuinely independent, and they have, it's more of a socialist type economy. Regarding the popularity of Assad, even at the before the conflict broke out, it was acknowledged even by the West that Assad was quite popular. The Economist said that 55% of the population supported him. That was The Economist, a conservative British publication.
Yeah,
Um, in,
and quite the neoliberal powerhouse, and quite the pro-imperialist uh,
exactly.
magazine, which the respectable people and the on the fence liberal left reads.
Right, right. I mean, the bottom line is it's for the Syrian people to decide. It's not for you or me or anybody else, Hillary Clinton or whoever else, to say who should be the running things in Syria. They actually had an election which had a high percentage, high participation. They overwhelmed the embassy in Beirut. In fact, Beirut was almost brought to a standstill by the hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees who were going to the embassy to vote. So there was a strong participation, and Assad won. I think it was something like 75 or 80% of
When
the
was this?
vote, competing against two candidates. That was in 2014.
Okay.
But the bottom line is that the right now, the situation is that the West has given up on the jihadists taking power, on overthrowing Assad militarily. So what their new call is there is no military solution. There's no military solution. You need to make enough concessions that we will. Uh, they've given up the military, but they have not given up the war. And it's simply shifted to to what they are officially called coercive measures. This is the goal of the newly enacted Caesar Act, which is a part of the National Defense Authorization for 2020, and that's being enforced this month, which heightens the sanctions on Syria even more, which declares the Central Bank of Syria as being primarily a money laundering operation, which puts it in a category of a bank that can't do business internationally or with any international bank or a bank associated or working with American banks. So the U.S. is trying to strangle Syria. There's been a lot of talk in the last 2 weeks. There's been tremendous protests about the killing of George Floyd by the police officer who had a knee on his neck and basically killed him. The U.S. has their knee on the neck of Syria, and they've been trying to get Syria to make concessions. They've been or to kill Syria, and Syria has resisted, but it's not easy. And the latest stage of things is very, very grim because beginning 6 months ago or 8 months ago, with the situation in Lebanon. The U.S. put the screws on banks in Lebanon, and a number of banks went bankrupt. They basically almost in a week. There was a 120-year-old bank that went out of business in 5 days. It's quite astounding. And the goal here is to heighten tensions in Lebanon and to damage Syria, because a lot of Syria was very closely connected to Lebanon, and especially in the banking sphere, a lot of imports would come in through Lebanon, and a lot of financial transactions happened via Lebanon, and that is no longer possible. So the knee on the neck, the U.S. is putting the knee on the neck of Syria, tremendously hurting the Syrian people, and they are so brazen as to openly admit it.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, because like I said, Syria is the forgotten war, and not many not many outlets cover Syria apart from the publications that publish or republish your work, which is Mintpress News, Globalresearch.ca, Consortium News, anti-war.com. So this leads. So that said, why is then that said, you mentioned Russia and how Russia is legally upholding international law, protecting the Syrian government, the Assad government. So why is Russia making deals with Erdogan? Why is Russia making deals with Erdogan with the Turkish government that exported ISIS or ISIS types of Sunni Salafist radical Wahhabi fundamentalists, and is still violating the sovereignty of Syria with the actions they took on this, on Rojava or the place or the Kurdish-dominated areas of Syria? And isn't Russia actually betraying Syria and Assad by making these deals with Turkey?
No, I think Russia is still a reliable ally and supporter of Syria. It's just that Russia is a much bigger country that has a much a broader perspective and a lot more interest at stake. They have to be concerned about NATO, which is on their doorstep. Turkey is a member of NATO. They're also concerned about oil, the international oil industry. So Russia has relations with Saudi Arabia. They also have relations with Israel. There's 1 million Russians who emigrated to Israel. So Russia's kind of the diplomat as I see it. When they take a military action, it's very decisive, as they've had to do it a few times. In Georgia, there was an incident where the Georgian authorities attacked the Russian communities in part of Georgia, and Russia intervened there. I think even people in the West said that Georgia was really out of line in doing that. Georgia, of course, being a former member of the Soviet Union. In a lot of the crisis that's emerged in the last 6 years is because of the coup that happened in Ukraine, and Crimea choosing to secede from Ukraine and rejoin Russia. And that's been a huge source of misinformation. A lot of people in the West don't know, because they've never been told that Crimea goes back 2.5 centuries to 1760s. It was part of Russia. The majority of people in Crimea, their first language is Russian. That Crimea was was given administratively or put in the Ukrainian republic's administration when they were all part of the Soviet Union, and it wasn't a big deal. The Crimean people weren't consulted on that. Khrushchev just did it, but it wasn't a big deal because they were all within the Soviet Union, one country. It became a big deal when Ukraine seceded. The people of Crimea did not like that, but they did not move to decisively rejoin Russia until the coup happened. And in one of the first actions of the coup parliament was to say that Russian was no longer an official language of Ukraine. So what happened then is they quickly organized a referendum in Crimea. That took place within 2 months. They did it. 90% said we want to rejoin Russia, and they did. And Russia backed them up. Russia had a military base there to begin with. That's their only Black Sea port. So Russia did not send troops there. They already had troops there as part of an agreement with Ukraine. So, I could go on and on about that because I visited Crimea and I spent 4 or 5 days there, talked with an amazing, a lot of people. In Crimea, they say we're 2 million people with 100 ethnicities. So it's very fascinating to talk to various people. It's not even close. It's overwhelming. I also talked with Ukrainians in Crimea, and they also said, no, Crimea has to be part of Russia. So the West did not like that, and that is where a lot of the anti-Russia tension, the anti-Russia mood, the new McCarthyism, the new Cold War, it emanates from the coup in Ukraine, which was promoted by the West, and that's not even debatable. I mean, you've got Victoria Nuland recorded on tape as saying who's going to be in the government after the coup, and who she said was going to be in the government should be in the government. So anybody who looks into this with an open mind will see that the coup was promoted by the West, and that Russia was responding defensively. But going back to your question, so that sets the stage for NATO's aggression against Russia, and the fact that Russia is concerned with Syria. They're a strategic ally of Syria. They will never give up. They will never give up the principle that the territorial integrity of Syria needs to be preserved, and that Turkish troops in northern Syria cannot be permanent. This is a temporary situation, but they are making accommodations as they see best. Considering every country, we have to be realistic. Every country is going to look out for their own interests. I think Russia has helped Syria tremendously. Where there are the differences have been exaggerated. I think Russia has largely been a good ally, but the fact is they've got some other things that they're looking at. They're looking at NATO, and if they can break away Turkey from NATO, that's going to help them. So I think being realistic, we have to look at the broader picture.
Do you think that's why Assad is tolerating having Turkey, which was a partner in crime and trying to destroy his country in these peace talks with the Putin government?
Well, I think they would, in some way, they would like to expel all the jihadists from Idlib. And then they would like to move on and expel the U.S. from eastern Syria. It's really earlier on.
Sorry to interrupt, but haven't they even sort of given amnesty to the Kurdish secession rebels that, like, hey, look, whatever you did, all sins are forgiven. You're Syrians to us, so come, come join us before these Turks come and pound you
Yeah.
guys.
Well, that's true, and I mean the Syrian government has been, from early on, they've been very flexible in inviting reconciliation. They bend over backward to invite people who chose the wrong path, who picked up arms and fought against the government. They bend over backwards trying to um, uh, bring them back into society and undo looking to the future as well, because of course the effects of a conflict, like a crisis like Syria has experienced, lives on into the future. And so for multiple reasons they've done everything possible to reconcile. Eventually there's going to be come a day of reckoning where they have to take the decision and move to expel the tens of thousands of militants who are in Idlib. Now, at the same time, the Caesar Act, which is just being enacted this month, you had James Jeffrey, the U.S. Point person on Syria, being interviewed just last Sunday, and he's very explicit. He says we want to promote aid to the northeast and the northwest, which basically he's talking about Idlib and the parts that are controlled by the so-called SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the Kurdish U.S. Group. So James Jeffrey is saying we need to promote that. We need to stop the reconstruction. We need to prevent the Syrian government from rebuilding. We need to prevent humanitarian aid. And we need to use the coercive measures of the Caesar Act to pressure the Syrian government. And so it's everybody who looks at the situation can see it, but it's from the horse's mouth. They're admitting it. The irony, of course, is that you had, a couple of years, 2 years of the Americans complaining bitterly about so-called Russian interference in their election. What that boiled down to was $75,000 worth of Facebook ads, which were debatable.
Which happened after the election.
Half of which happened after the election. That whole farce. But even if you accepted everything, all of these claims, many of which were not true, but if you accepted it, it doesn't amount to a teardrop in the ocean of other stuff that went on with the election in the U.S. and compare that interference with what the U.S. is doing to Syria. They've got their knee on the neck of Syria. They are just brutally trying to strangle, trying to choke, trying to take away the life sustenance of Syria. They've done it with foreign mercenaries. They've done it with people who were brainwashed. And some of the people, they weren't necessarily bad people. They became brainwashed, literally. They became religious fanatics, and they thought they were going to kill going there to protect women from the monster Assad. They really believed that propaganda. So the U.S. has done that, and now they're doing it. They're continuing to support their fanatics who remain, the tens of thousands who remain in Idlib, and their puppets. They're in the SDF, so-called SDF, and try and do everything the U.S. can to prevent Syria from rebuilding a war-torn country.
Yeah.
If ever there's a case for, the amorality of what the U.S. policy is stunning.
Same goes with France, Britain,
Yes. Yes.
Canada, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE,
Right.
Jordan, even, and Turkey. And I have to add, we talked about the white helmets last time. That Islamist front group. Turkey also funded the white helmets.
Yes, indeed. Well, it was especially the UK and the US with puppet support from Canada and Holland.
Yep. Holland too. I think even some of the Scandinavian countries, and
Sure.
that leads to one of my final questions. And you can be as brief about this or as long as you want to be about this, which is because I've just pissed off all of my Turkish nationalist friends. I'm probably not going to get an invite to Turkey anytime anytime soon. Probably not even going to have them on my Facebook friend list. But on to Israel. And I have a lot of friends who are ultra patriotic Israelis. Some of them who would even vote for Likud and think labor is too soft on the Palestinians. So talk about Israel's role in Syria, and then briefly, if you can, talk about how Israel's role in the destruction of Syria and the attempts to balkanize Syria. Talk about how that's a window into Israel actually being an imperial partner in crime to the U.S., the U.K., France, and so forth.
Yes. Earlier in the conflict, there were many analysts in the U.S. who said Israel was not invested in the conflict. They were just neutral bystanders. And from the outset, I said that was nonsense. And it wasn't too long after that I had, the case in point, the former ambassador to the former Israel ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren. He made it crystal clear. He said, if we have to choose between if we had to choose between the bad guys who are friends with Iran, that is the Assad government, and the bad guys who are not, that is the jihadists, we'll go with the ones who are not. And so very clearly they have been involved from the get-go. Of course, strategically they have for decades had the long-term strategy of breaking up their other nations of the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, with the idea that breaking them up along ethnic lines, which would be good for them. Number one, it would weaken those countries. Number two, it would take away a lot of their arguments against Israel, which of course is an apartheid country. There is discrimination based on your religion, ethnicity. That's explicit now.
Past guest on the show, Leah Tarachansky, formerly of the Real News Network, has described Israel as in ethnocracy, and other past guests, like Canadian historian Eve Engler, have described Israel as as what you just said.
Right. So, but basically, just a couple of facts. Israel provided military support to militant groups in southern Syria. They attacked Syrian forces when they were getting ready to overrun the jihadists. They provided medical support. You even have video of Netanyahu visiting bedside with the militants. The White Helmets made their escape from southern Syria through Israel. So from the get-go, Israel has been involved and has been hoping that the campaign to overthrow Assad and the Syrian government would be successful. I mean, another piece of evidence is that in 2010, before the conflict in Syria erupted, Hillary Clinton made some demands on Bashar al-Assad. These were these were requests, but they were the kind of requests that, well, we want you to do this. And the requests all involved the interests of Syria. So the United States, whether it's Hillary Clinton or somebody else, or Donald Trump, the United States builds its foreign policy to an amazing extent around the interests of Israel, a small foreign country that gets $4 billion a year from the U.S. A lot of Americans don't know just how much support is given to Israel, a huge amount financially and diplomatically and militarily. So they've been involved. I mean, just last week they bombed a city in Syria. I've got a Syrian friend. I was talking with him on Sunday, and he said how the kids were screaming. No families that we know of were killed, but people who were there reported on the terrorization of children. These are huge bombs that are going off, being fired by Israel, flying over Lebanon and then shooting them into Syria. So it's an ongoing process of terrorism, really, by Israel against Syria.
And now, okay, I'm going to, okay, so I'm going to try to be objective and present the Israeli point of view, even somebody who's and somebody who's a big supporter of Netanyahu, one of the most ultra right wing, ultra Zionist, ultra nationalist, really despicable, human beings of the world. But all right, let me try to present the Israeli point of view and someone who supports Netanyahu and say that, well, Rick, the reason why Israel is intervening in Syria and is fighting against both the Assad government and ISIS is because Assad supports Hamas, which wants to wipe us out. So this is for national security reasons. And you have Iran involved in Syria, and you have Hezbollah, which is also determined to wipe us out. And because Lebanon is too incompetent to deal with these militants, and because we're surrounded by hostile neighbors, we need to do our part in not just defeating Assad and his allies, but, ISIS and the jihadis.
Well, if your goal, or if you have your assumption being an apartheid state with preferential treatment for Jews and second-class citizenship for the Palestinians, if that's the basis of your argument, Jewish supremacy, basically, then that's probably the case. You have to do everything in your power, no matter whether it violates international law or not. I would argue that in this time and age, racism should be gone. They overcame official racism in South Africa. There's huge inequalities that remain there, but they managed to overcome the divide there, to do away with the apartheid laws, and they can do that in Israel, and they can abide by the Geneva Accord. The Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria, they have a right to return, and they should be allowed to return. They have more. They should be allowed to return, and Israel's big enough, and the Jewish population there is strong enough that they could live together with the Palestinians and have a safe society which is not based on apartheid. So I think the Israelis that I spent one summer. I lived in one summer in Palestine and visited with various Israelis and traveled around Israel. Some of the far-sighted ones agree with that. That's you can't be Jewish and democratic at the same time. If you're a Jewish state, that by definition is an ethnocracy, and when all your rules are based on preferential treatment, that is apartheid.
But well, Israel, of course, would Israel, of course, would deny that. They say that they're the only real democracy in the Middle East, the only real secular democracy in the Middle East, and that Israeli Arabs and Palestinians actually are much better off in Israel than any other part of the Middle East. And they would say that they're only being harsh towards these Palestinians because Hamas wants to wipe us off the map. Islamic Jihad wants to wipe us off the map. These Hezbollah people want to wipe us off the map. Iran wants to wipe us off the map. We would love to get along with Assad, but he recognizes it's one thing for him to recognize Fatah, which is secular, but he recognizes Hamas, and they want to wipe us off the map. Therefore, we have to attack. Syria, which did do a surprise attack on us, hence why the Golan Heights is now ours. And Israel, of course, would say, well, yeah. I mean,
well,
how would you push back against against an Israeli that says that?
Well, basically everything you said is the exact opposite is true. The Israelis are not the victims. They are the aggressors, whether it's with the the people in Gaza, or with Syria, or in the West Bank. They are not, they are not the victims. They are the aggressors, and the victimhood, is very effective in mobilizing the population and scaring the population and preventing any solution to the problem. I think if there was some authenticity at some point and some real discussions with Hamas or with progressive forces in the West Bank, they would find out that they can all live together and without the tension, without the hatred. But right now, it's clear it's not the people in Gaza who are the oppressors. The Israelis are basically strangling them. The analogy is very appropriate there also. The knee on the neck of the people of Gaza. 2 million people, locked in a little space, 4 miles wide by 20 miles long. You're born there, you live your life there, you die there, and you can't go out. You can't visit your family that lives in Bethlehem or Ramallah. You can't fish beyond the limits imposed by Israel. You can't. They control the borders. They control the exports. They control the imports. It's a suffocating oppression. And then what does that breed? Well, it doesn't breed, a friendship. But if they were, I was struck when I spent the summer of 2007 in the West Bank. I was struck by my host, who said they used to get along well with Jewish people in Jerusalem, and they can do that
before Israel was founded as an official Jewish state, right?
Well, I mean, but the tenet has been there. It was before the official declaration, but that has been the premise for decades now. So it was first, the PLO recognized Israel, and then they changed the agreement and said you had to recognize Israel. Now they say you have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, which, they changed the rules. The Oslo Accords were a disaster in the long run because Israel gained everything they wanted. They passed off all of the work and the tasks, and they gave nothing. All of the agreements and all of the measures that Israel was supposed to take, they didn't take. Arafat made the concessions. Right, and so in a way so the basic point is that the United States, to a tremendous extent, um, guides its foreign policy in the Middle East on the interests of this small country, Israel, which, and the results are very destructive. It's like Netanyahu said when he was promoting when there was still debate over whether the U.S. would invade Iraq.
Yeah,
at a critical time.
And I just have to say, for people who focus too much on what Israel does in Palestine, Israel does have a foreign policy and a very destructive imperial foreign policy, as Rick just mentioned. They'd rather have a jihadi state next to them as opposed to a secular one that recognizes Palestinian rights. Netanyahu supported the Iraq War. I repeat, Netanyahu supported the Iraq War, one of the biggest epic war crimes of the century. And continue with what you were saying.
And not only that, if you want to see an example of the amorality and the decisions of Israel and the West, look to Libya. I mean, where you had they prefer Libya the way it is now, anarchy, competing factions, competing warlords, uncertain situation for the last 9 years. Slave markets opened up in Tripoli. Floods of refugees heading out into the open Mediterranean Ocean with many thousands dying. This was created by the West and with the promotion and blessing of Israel. This was done by them. And how often do you hear the reckoning? Who's paying the price for that destruction? And I used to think, don't they ever realize how their policies are wrong? Then suddenly the conclusion has to be that they prefer this. They prefer this no matter how horrible it is for the people of Libya, the people of Iraq, and the people of Syria. They prefer this to the status quo where there's an independent government, they have an independent foreign policy, and which Syria does. They would rather have it broken up like Libya, or deteriorate into enormous bloodshed of sectarianism has happened in Iraq. That's what the goal has been for Syria, and Syria has survived. They've struggled. They're struggling today, but they've managed to keep going, and they're at a critical time now. But the chance, there's a good chance that they can continue to survive. They can come out ahead and prevail.
I also just need to mention that Israel not only has played a criminal part in trying to destroy Syria, as well as supporting the Iraq War. You mentioned Libya, but Israel also supported the military coup in Egypt. So Israel now also supports military dictatorship in Egypt. And yes, it's a good thing it is a good thing that the government is secular, but it's a terrible government that's propping up neoliberalism and is only going to inflame more people into getting into the Muslim Brotherhood, or worse, like Lebanon and Libya. You just have sectarianism and everyone just warring at each other's throat. And Israel also supported the recent coup in Sudan against Martin. Against Bashir. I'm not sure if it's Martin. No, it's not. Yeah, against the Bashar government, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. So I think maybe I've got some other things I need to get onto, Youri.
All right. No problem. Well, actually, we more or less covered everything. We more or less covered everything we wanted to, everything I want to cover with you. But Rick, before this conversation, First of all, I want to thank you for coming on 1+1, and nothing, no technical difficulties have affected us.
Good, good.
But I also just want to say that we hope to have you as a regular on 1+1, because the goal of 1+1 is not only to provide more more space for anti-imperial politics, and like I said, it's for inconvenience, truth-telling, and myth-busting. But we also want to give a platform to independent journalists and anti-imperialists such as yourself, who beyond my comprehension are not sought out more on left-leaning outlets, even the best left-leaning outlets, which I subscribe to on YouTube. So thank you very much for coming on 1+1. We really hope to have you back on again very soon, because there's so much more that we need to discuss, like the anti-Russia hysteria, anti-Chinese hysteria, and also the attack on the free press, and celebrate the real muckrakers that are that are doing award-winning work, such as yourself, because you were awarded the Serena Shemy Award, right?
Yes, that's right. Well, it's my pleasure, Youri. I like your T-shirt, which says "I'm with WikiLeaks."
Yep.
Free Julian Assange. That's another big topic. But anyway, it was nice to be with you. And yeah, if we can talk again in future sometime, that'd be great.
Definitely. And let's hope Julian Assange does get let's pray that he's not only released from Belmarsh prison, but he's released into the arms of his family, and not a United States prison.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you very much, Nick. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.